For decades, scientists looking at Cameroon thought they were looking at a crossroads, a place where populations from West Africa, Central Africa, and the ancient Bantu world had simply met and mixed. But then ancient DNA from one small archaeological site in western Cameroon produced a result that changed the entire story. Researchers recovered genetic material from children who lived there roughly 8,000 and 3,000 years ago, right inside the region long considered the probable homeland of the Bantu languages. One of those ancient individuals carried the deeply divergent Y chromosome lineage A0, a paternal lineage that is still found almost exclusively in the same broad region today. That sounds like the missing ancestor. The obvious conclusion would be that these ancient Cameroonians were the people who eventually spread Bantu ancestry across Africa. But the genome said something completely different. The ancient individuals were not substantially ancestral to modern Bantu-speaking populations in Cameroon or anywhere else. Their genomes were much closer to ancient West Central African hunter-gatherer populations, and suddenly, one of the biggest assumptions about African population history collapsed. The people living in the Bantu homeland before the Bantu expansion were not necessarily the same people who later carried Bantu languages across the continent. Somewhere inside Cameroon, an older African population had been living there, changing, moving, and surviving for thousands of years before a different demographic wave transformed the continent. The real Cameroon DNA mystery was not simply where Bantu people came from, it was who was already there before them, what happened to those people, and how much of their genetic legacy survived inside the populations living in Cameroon today. That discovery begins at Shumlaka, a rock shelter in the grassfields region of western Cameroon. Archaeologists had already known the site was important because it preserves an unusually long sequence of human activity. The area sits directly within the region that linguists and archaeologists have long proposed as one of the most likely places where the ancestral Bantu language developed before Bantu-speaking populations began spreading south and east across Africa. For generations, this created an intuitive story. If Bantu languages came from this region, perhaps the people who lived there thousands of years ago were the direct ancestors of the people who later carried those languages across the continent. Ancient DNA finally allowed scientists to test that assumption. Researchers recovered genome-wide DNA from 4 children buried at Shumlaka, 2 dating to roughly 8,000 years ago and 2 to about 3,000 years ago. The result was astonishing. All 4 individuals had ancestry profiles most similar to present-day hunter-gatherer populations from western Central Africa, not to modern Bantu-speaking communities. The researchers therefore concluded that the ancient people represented at Shumlaka did not contribute substantially to the genetic ancestry of modern Bantu speakers, despite living directly inside the region regarded as the Bantu homeland. One of those 4 children makes the story even more extraordinary. His Y chromosome belonged to haplogroup A0, one of the deepest known branches of the human paternal family tree. A100 is extremely rare today and is concentrated in western Cameroon and nearby regions. The lineage was first identified through modern genetic studies and is remarkable because it split from other known Y chromosome lineages so deeply in human history that its divergence reaches hundreds of thousands of years into the past. The ancient Shumlaka individual carried this lineage thousands of years ago, demonstrating that the deepest layers of human paternal history were not abstract branches hidden in a database. They were physically present in Cameroon. His DNA places one of humanity's most ancient known Y chromosome lineages directly inside an archaeological context, turning Cameroon into one of the most important places on Earth for understanding the early structure of the human population. But the crucial point remains. Carrying one of the oldest paternal lineages did not make this individual the direct ancestor of Bantu populations. His genome tells a different story, one about an older population that lived in the region before later demographic transformations. This is where the phrase lost ancestral layer becomes meaningful. Imagine Cameroon as a geological core sample. The upper layers represent populations living there today. Beneath them are ancestors from the last few centuries. Beneath those are populations from the medieval period. Far deeper are communities living around the beginning of agriculture and metalworking. And below all of that are even older hunter-gatherer populations whose histories reach into the deep African past. The mistake in older narratives was to assume that the population visible at one layer must be the direct ancestor of everything above it. Ancient DNA shows that this is not always true. Populations can disappear, move, merge, or be replaced while leaving different amounts of ancestry behind. A region can be an important cultural homeland without the people living there at one moment becoming the main ancestors of later populations. Shumlaka is a perfect example. It was located inside the Bantu homeland, but the people represented by its ancient genomes were not the main genetic ancestors of the Bantu expansion. Culture, language, geography, and ancestry had already begun moving on different tracks. And the Cameroon story becomes even more interesting when we look at the scale of the Bantu expansion itself. A major genomic study published in Nature analyzed 1,563 individuals, including 1,526 Bantu speakers, from 147 populations across 14 African countries. The research described the spread of Bantu-speaking peoples as the most dramatic demographic event of the late Holocene in Africa. According to the study, the expansion began in Western Africa around 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, and gradually transformed the linguistic, cultural, and genetic landscape of a huge portion of the continent. Genetic diversity among Bantu-speaking populations decreases with increasing distance from Western Africa, supporting a serial founder model in which populations moved in successive waves, with each migrating group carrying only a subset of the genetic diversity of the population it left behind. This model explains why Cameroon and neighboring Western regions are so important. They preserve the earliest stages of a demographic expansion that later reached Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. But the ancient individuals from Shumlaka demonstrate that the people who lived in this homeland before the expansion were not simply identical to the people who later carried Bantu languages outward. That distinction changes the way we should imagine the Bantu homeland. It was not an empty starting point occupied by one uniform population, waiting to spread across the continent. It was already inhabited by people with their own histories, genetic diversity, and cultural networks. Some of those populations interacted with incoming groups. Some may have been absorbed. Some may have moved into other ecological zones. Some may have disappeared as recognizable communities while leaving ancestry behind. Others may have survived in genetically distinct forms. The Bantu expansion, therefore, was not simply an outward movement from a single homogeneous population. It was a demographic transformation happening inside a region that was already populated. This is exactly why ancient DNA is so valuable. Modern populations only show us the final result. Ancient genomes allow scientists to see some of the intermediate stages before later migrations reshape the map. And Cameroon is exceptionally important because it contains enormous genetic diversity. A large study analyzing genome-wide data from more than 1,333 individuals representing over 150 ethnic groups from Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan found fine-scale genetic structure within countries that had previously been treated as broadly uniform in many genetic datasets. Cameroon was particularly striking. Researchers found that populations within the country could be differentiated at a very fine geographic scale, sometimes correlating with historical political structures and migration pathways. They also found evidence of long-distance migration linking northern Cameroon and Sudanese populations with distant regions, while Bantu-speaking groups showed genetic signals consistent with later expansions. One research highlight summarizing the study noted that Cameroon can contain as much genetic diversity by some measures as the whole of Europe. That is an extraordinary statement because it means the word Cameroonian is genetically far too broad to describe one ancestry. The country is not one population. It is a collection of many populations that have interacted across thousands of years. This fine-scale diversity is visible in western Cameroon, where multiple ethno-linguistic communities occupy relatively close geographic areas, yet preserve different genetic histories. The Grassfields region, in particular, contains a mosaic of communities whose languages, cultural traditions, and genetic relationships cannot be reduced to one common origin. Some groups are Bantu-speaking, others speak languages associated with different branches of the Niger-Congo family. And underneath these modern linguistic divisions are deeper layers of ancient ancestry that predate today's languages entirely. This is why the ancient Shumlaka results are so important. The ancient population represented at the site may have been part of a long-lived Western Central African hunter-gatherer network, whose descendants survive in some modern Central African populations, while the Bantu-speaking populations that later became dominant across much of the region came from a different demographic process. The Central African hunter-gatherer story is itself much older than the Bantu expansion. A 2024 Nature Human Behavior study examined 382 individuals from 10 populations representing Central African hunter-gatherer communities and found evidence of long-term cultural exchange across enormous distances. The researchers argued that the deep history of these communities cannot simply be treated as a short pre-Bantu period followed by replacement from farming populations. Instead, hunter-gatherer populations maintained interconnected social and cultural networks over very long periods, exchanging tools, musical traditions, ecological knowledge, and vocabulary. Importantly, researchers were able to identify different layers of ancestry by computationally masking more recent Bantu-derived segments, revealing deeper relationships among hunter-gatherer groups that might otherwise have been hidden. This suggests that ancient Cameroon belonged to a far more extensive network of Central African populations than the simple Bantu versus hunter-gatherer model implies. And that means one of the oldest stories in Cameroon may not actually be the story of farmers and kingdoms. It may be the story of forests. The Congo Basin and surrounding Central African ecosystems supported human populations for extremely long periods. Hunter-gatherers learned how to move through dense forest environments, track wildlife, collect plant resources, and maintain knowledge systems adapted to particular ecological zones. Over time, different hunter-gatherer populations became genetically differentiated while continuing to exchange culture and perhaps marriage partners across forest networks. These populations were not static. They moved and interacted, but their demographic history differed dramatically from the later farming populations that expanded across much of the region. The new genetic evidence is therefore beginning to reveal Central Africa as a long-lived network rather than an empty landscape suddenly transformed by agricultural migrants. One of the most fascinating parts of the Cameroon story is that genetic continuity and genetic replacement can occur simultaneously in different regions. In one place, an ancient population may contribute heavily to modern descendants. In another, it may leave almost no detectable ancestry. A third region might preserve a small but identifiable genetic trace. This is exactly what researchers are discovering across Central Africa. There is no single continent-wide demographic rule. Different populations experienced different outcomes. Some hunter-gatherer groups were partially absorbed by farming communities. Others were displaced. Others maintained distinct ancestry, despite centuries of interaction. The same is true of later Bantu-speaking groups. Some migrated relatively far with little initial admixture. Others mixed substantially with local populations. By the time Bantu languages reached southern Africa, the resulting populations already carried the genetic signatures of many interactions along the journey. The enormous Bantu expansion, therefore, becomes a story of serial transformation. The first expansion began in western Central Africa. Populations moved south and east. Each new generation established itself in a new region, adapted to local environments, and encountered people already living there. New populations formed from those interactions. Genetic diversity gradually declined with geographic distance from the homeland because each migration wave carried a subset of the ancestry of the previous population. But at the same time, local admixture added new genetic layers. This is why modern Bantu-speaking populations are related to one another, while remaining visibly and genetically diverse. They share an ancestry connected to Western Central Africa, but each regional population also carries the history of the people it encountered. This is particularly visible in Southern Africa. Bantu-speaking groups eventually moved into regions where indigenous hunter-gatherer populations had lived for tens of thousands of years. Genetic research shows that modern Southern African Bantu-speaking populations preserve ancestry from earlier populations while also carrying the Western African ancestry associated with the Bantu expansion. Some modern communities, therefore, contain layers representing multiple ancient populations that encountered one another thousands of years apart. The same process can be seen in Zambia, where a 2024 study of Batwa populations found that these communities retain hunter-gatherer-related ancestry alongside Western African ancestry associated with later Bantu expansions. The modern genetic map is therefore a palimpsest. Old populations are not necessarily erased. Their ancestry can remain underneath newer layers. Now return to Cameroon, because the country itself offers another major clue. The northern part of Cameroon has a very different population history from the humid southern and western regions. Populations there have long interacted with the Sahel and Lake Chad Basin. Trans-Saharan trade, the expansion of Islamic states, and movements between northern Nigeria, Chad, Sudan, and Cameroon left genetic signatures that are distinct from those of southern Cameroon. The large multi-ethnic dataset found evidence of long-distance migration connecting northern Cameroonian and Sudanese groups with populations far beyond the country's modern borders. This means Cameroon can't be understood only through the Bantu expansion. It also sits at the meeting point between Central Africa and the Sahel. Different migration systems crossed the country from different directions. Some were thousands of years old, others occurred in the medieval period. This is why the phrase Cameroonian DNA can be misleading. A person from northern Cameroon may have a very different ancestral profile from someone from the western grass fields or the southern forest zone. Two people can share the same nationality and have very different genetic histories. This is not unique to Cameroon, but Cameroon illustrates the problem unusually well because of its enormous ethno-linguistic diversity. The country contains many populations that preserve distinct linguistic and historical traditions. Ancient DNA confirms that these differences are not merely cultural, they often have genetic correlates as well. And yet there is also a deep connection running underneath them. Many of these populations have lived in the same broad ecological region and participated in ancient networks of movement and exchange. The genetic differences do not mean they were isolated worlds. Instead, they represent populations that repeatedly interact without becoming completely homogenized. This is one of the central patterns emerging from modern African population genetics. Connection without uniformity. The most dramatic proof may still be A-Zorzir. Today, the lineage is strongly associated with western Cameroon and nearby regions. Its discovery forced scientists to revise the history of the Y chromosome because it represents a branch that diverged far earlier than many previously known paternal lineages. The Shumlaka discovery placed A00 in an archaeological context thousands of years old. That tells us that deep human genetic diversity in Cameroon was not produced by recent migrations. Some of its roots extend deep into the early history of Homo sapiens. The region preserved genetic lineages that had already diverged long before the emergence of agriculture, states, or the modern ethnic identities we recognize today. But there is an important warning. Azar words should not be treated as a Cameroon gene. It is one paternal lineage, not the genome of an entire population. Carrying A-or-Zur does not mean someone is descended from every ancient population that ever lived in Cameroon. Likewise, the ancient Shumlaka children do not represent the complete ancient population of Western Cameroon. 4 individuals are only 4 individuals. They provide extraordinary evidence, but they are not a full demographic census. Scientists must compare them with modern and ancient populations from many sites to reconstruct the broader pattern. That is precisely what later studies have begun doing, and the broader evidence consistently points toward the same conclusion. Cameroon contains multiple ancient ancestry layers. One is associated with deep West Central African hunter-gatherer history. Another is associated with the Bantu expansion that began thousands of years later. Additional layers come from Sahelian and trans-Saharan connections, especially in northern regions. There are also localized histories associated with specific political kingdoms, trade networks, and migration corridors. No single layer explains the country. That is why the title, "The Cameroonians Were Never Who We Thought," actually has a scientific meaning. The mistake wasn't believing Cameroonians were African. Of course they are. The mistake was imagining that being Cameroonian meant sharing one ancestral history. The genetic evidence says the opposite. Cameroon was already diverse before Cameroon existed as a political entity. The modern country brought many populations under one national border, but the DNA remembers the older landscapes beneath that border. And perhaps the most surprising discovery is that the population sitting in the middle of the Bantu homeland may not have been the population that created the demographic world we associate with it today. The ancient Shumlaka people lived there first. Their descendants may survive in some modern Central African hunter-gatherer populations. Meanwhile, Bantu-speaking populations expanded from the broader Nigeria-Cameroon region and eventually transformed half a continent. 2 stories unfolded in the same geographical space. One population left a deep but relatively localized genetic legacy. Another launched one of Africa's greatest population expansions. The result is not a contradiction. That is the point. Human history is not a single line. It is layers. The ancient foragers, the early populations of the grass fields, the communities that became involved in the Bantu expansion, the hunter-gatherers who lived across the Congo Basin, the populations that later moved through the Sahel, the medieval trade networks, the modern ethnic communities. Each layer was added to the one before it. Some populations expanded, some contracted, some disappeared, some survived, and many left DNA behind. The genetic map of Cameroon, therefore, tells a story much older than the country itself. Long before modern borders, there were populations moving through forests, mountains, savannas, and river systems. Long before anyone spoke Bantu languages, people lived in Western Cameroon. Long before kingdoms appeared, communities were exchanging knowledge across Central Africa. And long before scientists could read DNA, those histories were already written into the chromosomes of their descendants. The Shumlaka children give us one of the clearest windows into that forgotten past. They remind us that a homeland does not necessarily mean a single population. A language homeland does not necessarily equal a genetic homeland. A modern ethnic group does not necessarily descend directly from every ancient person who lived in its territory, and a population can disappear from history while leaving part of its biological legacy behind. That is the real lost ancestral layer. It wasn't waiting in a tomb labeled the first Cameroonians. It was hidden inside the DNA, and now researchers can finally read it. The bigger question is what they will discover next. Shumlaka gave us 4 genomes. Cameroon contains thousands of archaeological sites and an extraordinary diversity of modern populations that remain underrepresented in global genomic databases. More ancient samples could reveal additional populations that existed before the Bantu expansion. New discoveries could show whether some modern Cameroonian communities preserve more ancestry from these ancient layers than we currently realize. They could reveal unknown migration routes. They could even change our understanding of exactly how the Bantu expansion began and why it transformed Africa so dramatically. Because the story is still incomplete, and that may be the most exciting thing about it. For the first time, scientists are not simply asking where Bantu populations went. They are asking who was already there, who survived, who disappeared, who mixed, and which ancient lineages are still quietly living inside people today. Cameroon may have been one of the starting points of the largest demographic transformation in late Holocene Africa. But the people living there before that transformation were not erased from the scientific story. Their DNA brought them back. And the deeper researchers go, the clearer the message becomes. The genetic history of Cameroon was never one population moving forward. It was a series of ancient populations meeting, separating, surviving, and leaving different pieces of themselves behind. The country we see today is only the latest layer. The real story began thousands of years earlier, and parts of those forgotten people are still here.